Okay, this is a recording of a lecture in Geography 410 at the University of Idaho, Biogeography. This chapter is what I call SDM, Species Distribution Modeling. It's called that because there's no corresponding chapter in the McDonald textbook. Learning outcomes of this chapter are that upon completion of this chapter, students should be able to first describe why modeling in general is used, what a model is, and how a model is developed and used, its application in other words. And then the second is specific to biogeography, and that is what is a species distribution model per se, how it's used, and discuss its strengths and weaknesses. So the first part, SDM1, is the introduction to modeling. So the question is, first, why use modeling? Models are often used in many areas of our daily life. For instance, weather forecast models are used, predictions are made about economic forecasts, and so there's a variety of applications for models, not just biogeography. The reasons for using models, particularly in scientific topics, are to demonstrate some understanding of a process. So if a scientist can model a process correctly, a process meaning perhaps the distribution of a species, that means that we have good understanding of what controls that distribution. But also the reverse can occur, is if the model can't accurately predict a species distribution, for instance, then we probably don't understand enough about what the controls are of that distribution. We need to increase our understanding with experiments, observations, or other aspects before we can correctly model the species. Second reason for using modeling is to assess the sensitivity of some process to controlling factors. Climate change is an obvious one in biogeography, so if one can build a model, then one can understand how with warmer or colder conditions, how species ranges can contract or expand. Third reason for using a model is to fill in gaps in space and time that we may have based on observations alone. So especially with species, it's very difficult to go out and survey all the potential places that an organism lives. And so if we can build a useful model that predicts where species distribution is, then we can fill in these gaps that we can't have sampled with observations. So that's in space, but that can happen in time too. If we want to look backwards in time, if we know the controlling factors such as climate back in the ice ages, we can then predict what will happen with species ranges or out into the future given future climate change. And lastly, we can make predictions given expected changes in controlling factors. So that's similar to B. B is more related to basic understanding of, for instance, the controls of the environment, such as habitat or climate. Whereas D is really if we do want to predict what will happen to a species range given climate change. We can do that with a model, or a species range given that its food resources are moving around or disappearing or being eliminated by human activities, that sort of thing. So making predictions is important. In biogeography, I've given some examples already, but basically in biogeography models, and particularly species distribution models, are used in two ways or more. These are two examples. First way is to estimate where a species is located. Again, we can't sample all locations in space or time. And so for conservation purposes, for instance, if a species is endangered or threatened, we'd like to know where the species might be located so we can actually direct future field observational studies to survey those locations. And then to see how, for conservation purposes, how the habitat might be changing in the future, given deforestation, for instance. And then the second is to assess the responses of species to climate change, which is, of course, a very important global environmental change issue that relates to biodiversity loss, species extinctions, etc. And so by building models, we can assess how changes in a species habitat will be impacted by future climate change. And of course, there are responses to other global environmental changes, such as pollution, or deforestation, or overuse, or fragmentation of habitat by humans. Models can also be used to assess those things. So what is a model? A model, very simply, is a simplified representation of reality. It's some way to represent a process using simplified constructs based on our scientific understanding. So there are general two classes of models. One is a process or mechanistic model, and the other is an empirical or statistical model. The differences are that in a mechanistic or process-based model, for instance, in a weather forecast model, as you can see and by this figure in the diagram here, these are based on mechanisms that are responsible for driving the process of interest. So, for instance, in a particular species, if we're thinking about a species distribution, maybe that species is very sensitive to very hot conditions because it doesn't easily cool itself down through sweating, for instance, evaporation of water. And so there might be mechanistic representation of that effect in the fact that in the model, by changing the metabolic rate, the rate of heat loss as a function of size of the animal, for instance, things like that are very physically, mechanistically based. In the case of the weather forecast model, which is easy to think about, there are physical processes like pressure and temperature that drive wind distributions, that drive evaporation, that produce clouds based on relative humidity, things like that. Those are very physical, mechanistic processes that are included in numerical weather prediction models. As an alternative, if we don't understand the mechanisms very well, we can use statistical modeling. This is often used in biology or ecology because of the lack of underlying fundamental principles, first principles that we have for physics, for things like weather. And so we're often just relating two things together without actually including the mechanisms simply because we don't understand them. And so in this figure on the bottom here, this is just an illustration of a regression model where we might have observations of temperature along the x-axis and some process like photosynthesis on the y-axis. So each of these blue dots is an observation, and then we fit a line to it. In this case, the linear line is y equals mx plus b. And then include that in the model. So that's a statistical example. We're letting the data tell us what the relationship is here, what the linear fit is to the model. But we don't actually understand what the mechanisms are that may drive this. We don't care what they are necessarily. Okay, so a model, whether it's empirical or mechanistic, is structured in a few different ways. These are typically, the comments I'm going to make now are typically related to statistical models, but they also apply to mechanistic or process models. So there's a set of response or dependent variables, or an output variable in the case of a model. These are the things that the model produces. What are the predictions? What are the things that the model predicts? So in biogeography, it's desirable for these species distribution models to predict the distribution or range or habitat, potential habitat of a species. Where is it likely to occur? But also abundance, or the number of individuals, or how rare it is within at a particular location is really useful. However, abundance is very difficult, often because there aren't data to support development of a model. So usually what you see in the scientific literature is distribution models based on presence and absence. Nothing about, within the presence locations, nothing about the number of individuals that can survive there. Second, there's a set of predictor variables, explanatory variables, independent variables. These are all the same thing. They're basically inputs to the model. And for species distribution models, we consider usually the physical or abiotic environment So soils, climate, topography are often drivers. Sometimes studies include vegetation type. For instance, if an animal has a particular requirement for food resources or habitat resources, we can include that as a input variable to the model. Models can be either linear or nonlinear. Linear models tend to be easier to develop, especially in a statistical sense. It's easier to constrain them, particularly when the number of observations are low. But more advanced techniques have developed in the last few decades that allow for nonlinear relationships, which are often important because, for instance, plant optimal photosynthesis occurs, or plant photosynthesis occurs at an optimum, so that it's a hump-shaped nonlinear relationship between, say, temperature and photosynthesis. So nonlinear relationships can be important. And then the output variable is usually a continuous variable, that is, it ranges across all the real numbers. But sometimes there can be a classification variable or model which produces a categorical output variable. So categorical just means instead of all the real numbers, it produces a set of categories. And in species distribution models, usually that's 0 for absence or presence, 1 for presence. So models are often initially outputting continuous variables like probability of presence, which ranges from 0 to 1. But then they need to be converted to 0 or 1, presence or absence or presence, using some cutoff method that I'll describe later. Okay, so what does one need to do in order to develop a model? So first, or to develop and use a model, the first thing to do is to develop the model. This is also called model building. Basically, the model needs to be created based on observations or experiments or scientific understanding from other studies. So we need to know something about the species of interest to build a model. The second thing after a model is built is an evaluation of the model. How good is the model? This step is not often as emphasized as it could be in studies. But basically, there are several steps. One is once the model is built, based on some observations, we'd like to know how good the model fits those observations that are used to build the model. So that's an accuracy assessment of the predictions of the model relative to the observations that were used to develop the model. How good does the model fit the observations? The second thing is sensitivity to the observations. If you remove 5% of the observations, does the model look very different? Hopefully not, but it could be sensitive to that. And then the third thing is the ability for the model to correctly predict independent locations, that is, observations that weren't used in the model development. So oftentimes model development removes, say, 50% of the observations and withholds them, doesn't use them in the model development. The other 50% are used in the model development. And then later, the modeler tests the ability of the model to accurately predict the 50% that were withheld. So that's independent test data. And that's really useful for evaluating whether predictions of the model are going to be accurate. So that's an independent evaluation. Okay, once the model's developed and evaluated satisfactorily, then scientists can begin to use the model to understand something about the species of interest or the process of interest. Here I'm using process as things like in biogeography, something about an ecosystem functioning, like carbon cycling or water use, in addition to species distribution modeling. But for biogeography, the emphasis here will be on species range or distribution. So one question is, if a model fit is poor, maybe that just suggests that the modeling needs to stop and be used as a guide to perform additional experiments or go out and observe this particular species more. Try and understand better what controls the species distribution before we can correctly model it. So right off the bat, that could be sort of the dead end or the end of the modeling study. But assuming the model fit is not poor, then you can the modeler can do a few things. Do some variable importance. There might be a suite of potential explanatory variables that range often in biogeography from temperature to precipitation to elevation to soil features. Maybe one or two of those out of 10 potential variables are important, and so modelers can do some tests to see if which of these explanatory variables are most important. That'll be useful for increasing understanding of the species. And then for those variables that are important, if the response is allowed to be nonlinear, then we can increase the understanding of that species by understanding what the relationship between an explanatory variable, an input variable is, and the prediction of presence or absence. So it might be that there's some thresholds involved in these relationships. You can imagine that it might be very important for insects to not experience temperatures below freezing for winter survival, for instance, around Moscow. Maybe they need to take cover or shelter in cases of very cold conditions, but they can do that if temperatures don't reach much below say 28 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever it is, whatever that threshold is. But above that threshold, if the temperature's 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 or 50, it doesn't really matter for winter survival because that organism isn't going to survive any better. So that's an example of a nonlinear relationship that might not be obvious. And so exploring that relationship is going to be useful for understanding what the mechanisms are that drive that relationship. Okay, and then the application of the model is making predictions, filling in gaps in space and time. So here we change the explanatory variables, meaning input new explanatory variables, a changed climate, a warmer climate, for instance, and see what happens with the model predictions. This is useful for understanding what climate impacts might be on a particular species. There is, however, the dangers of extrapolating beyond the range of values used to develop the model. So what I mean by that is if you are interested in giraffes and you developed a statistical model that's where giraffes are now, so giraffes range from conditions of, I don't know what, 50 degrees Fahrenheit and mean annual temperature to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But if we're predicting, and that's a statistical relationship, you could build a model that does very well within that temperature range, very accurate model. But now, given future warming, the range in Africa of giraffe habitat might be pushed to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, say. That's a big change. Probably not going to happen anytime soon, but for purposes of illustration, think about that. Now you're pushing the model outside of the range in which it was developed. And so there's that's extrapolating, that's a little bit dangerous, so one just has to be careful of that. Okay, second part of this lecture is species distribution models in particular. We've covered a lot that is general to models, also specific to species distribution models, but now we'll focus on species distribution models here. So these models are used to obviously predict the distribution of an individual species. They're also called niche models, I'll explain that in a minute, or bioclimatic envelope models, or climate envelope models. And I'll explain that in a slide or two. So what's the definition of, what is meant by ecological niches? A niche is a multidimensional resource space in which a species exists. So that's conceptual, and it's often used in terms of an environmental variable such as temperature. So I mentioned this giraffe example, made-up example. Maybe giraffes experience the temperature niche of 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but can't exist outside that. So that would be the range or the niche of giraffes relative to temperature. There are two additional concepts related to niches. One is something called the fundamental niche. That's the potential range of a species. The potential range of a variable occupied, or that could be occupied by that species. So going back to the giraffes, based on metabolic conditions and physiological understanding of giraffes, we might expect that giraffes can tolerate 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit as the mean annual temperature. That'd be the potential range. The second part is related, or the second term, fundamental niche, is related to that, but that's the actual range of a variable experienced by a species or observations of a species. So although we might understand that giraffes can experience 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, we might actually only observe them between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't have any observations of temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit because for various reasons. And those reasons are actually really important. They have to do with biotic controls on species distributions that I'll get into in a bit. Okay, so here's a figure that illustrates that. I give you the figure caption, which is long, but I'll kind of walk you through these two figures. So up here in the upper left is a space. Basically, you can think of it as a map, X and Y, or latitude, longitude. And the circles indicate the potential distribution of a particular species. So there are three polygons, A, B, and C. The pluses indicate observational records. So within polygon C, you can see that there are various pluses, observations. The gray is the actual distribution, even if it's unknown. So most of polygon C is occupied by this particular species, even though we haven't observed it everywhere there. All of polygon A is occupied, but there are no observations of the species there. But polygon B is a potential distribution, that is, the environmental conditions are suitable, but the species doesn't actually occupy it anywhere in this B polygon. So the outlines of the polygons form the fundamental distribution. That's where the species could potentially occupy. The gray areas indicate the realized niche. Sorry, let me back up. The polygons are the fundamental niche. The gray is the realized niche, where the actual species is actually present. That's in geographical space. This geographical space has environmental characteristics at each location, say temperature, mean annual temperature, and total annual precipitation, two environmental variables. So each of these locations has that. If you take and plot these locations on these axes of the environmental variable 1, say mean annual temperature, environmental 2, say total precipitation, then you can plot each of these locations within for the observations in the pluses in this space, also for the realized niche in gray, and the fundamental niche. So that's the conversion of this geographical space into environmental space. And then this niche space is what's modeled by species distribution models. Note that the fundamental niche contains or covers more environmental space than the realized niche. And again, these areas that are white, but within the polygon in E, are associated with biotic interactions. So that's discussed in the caption down here, but biotic interactions include competition. So if there's a competitor to this particular species that occurs in this E region, and it's a superior competitor, then it keeps that species out of that area. Or if there's a predator that lives in this area, but not in this gray area D. So these are are possibilities. If you look in the geographic space, it's possible that this polygon B, which is potentially suitable habitat in terms of temperature and precipitation, but not occupied, maybe that's across an ocean or a major mountain range. So there are barriers to dispersal that prevent a species from actually occupying this polygon B. So those are some biotic interaction reasons for why the fundamental niche could be greater than the realized niche. Okay, so here's a simple example of this species distribution model. Again, species distribution models tend to be, the current state of the art is that there's statistical relationships between climate or other environmental factors like soils or topography and a species distribution. So down here is an example. Along the x-axis is temperature that ranges from hot to cold. The y-axis in the observations is either presence is 1 or absence is 0. So this is a categorical variable in terms of the model input, in terms of the observations that are used to build the model. So the presence models points, the observations are in green, the absence points are in red. Basically, if you go back to here, you can see that maybe each of these presence or presence points corresponds to a plus, and that each of these locations has a particular temperature that you can then plot. So presence points here, and in this case, excuse me, there is a set of points where field observations have been taken, but no species was found there, or the species was not found at these locations. That forms the absence points. Some species distribution modeling techniques, such as what you'll use later, Maxent, only develops a model based on presence points only. But it's more powerful to use both presence and absence points. Okay, so those are the observations. The model is then fit to that. In this case, it's a sigmoidal or logistic regression model. Sigmoidal is sort of S-shape where the probability is very low at cold temperatures, very high probability at hot temperatures. So that's the model. You can see the model predicts a continuous output in terms of probability of presence. So it could predict 0.4 as a model output, which is, of course, tough to compare to either 0 or 1, presence or absence. So one of the considerations is what is the cutoff value of probability of presence that converts the continuous model output, this curve, into either zeros or ones. And an easy way to do that is to use the cutoff value of 0.5. So at 0.5, this is a temperature that corresponds about here. Any temperatures greater than that correspond to presence based on this model. Any temperatures lower than that correspond to absence. Okay, so what are some goals about errors? There will be errors in models. And these tend to be associated or similar for all models, in particular statistical models, but I'll talk about these errors with the example of species distribution models. So the first goal is to minimize or eliminate omission errors. And what's an omission error? An omission error is when the model predicts for a particular temperature an absence. So this particular temperature here, the model, given this curve, predicts about a probability of 0.25, say, which is then converted to an absence. But in fact, there were observations of the species at this temperature. And so the model omits this from its prediction, and that's considered an error. The other aspect is to minimize commission errors, which are the opposite. So in this case, the model for, say, this temperature here, the model predicts a probability of 0.8, which is then converted into presence. But in fact, at these temperatures, there were observations of species, there were records of the absence of a species at these temperatures. So the model is incorrectly predicting an absence. Now you can see that there's overlap between presence observations and absence observations. And that suggests that some other factor is influencing the species distribution besides just temperature. But in this case of in this particular case where there's only one explanatory variable, temperature, the model can't get all of these observations correctly, so it tries to minimize both the omission and the commission error. So here's an example. Again, commission errors are hard because you need absence data, which isn't often recorded. But that's really important because if you think about if you're just interested in minimizing the omission error, you could have a model that predicts presence everywhere regardless of temperature. So that's this case here. If a model predicted presence everywhere regardless of temperature, then the omission error is 0, right? You've correctly predicted all of the presence values. But of course you have now have a huge commission error because there's all these absences that you are incorrectly predicting. So it's not useful in this sense to not consider commission error. You have to minimize commission error as well, but again, the issue is that it's challenging to obtain absence data. And the reason it's challenging is because A, how do you survey for absence? You have to be pretty careful about that. And B, you have to construct a survey that is not just recording the presence of a species, but you actually have to spend time searching for the species to verify with high confidence that the species is not present. And you can imagine for insects or animals that hide, that could be quite challenging. Okay, so what are some strengths of species distribution models? There are strengths. First, they're fairly easy to develop. You're going to actually do this as a homework assignment. Develop a species distribution model. There are techniques out there. One can rely on other people's observations, museum records. There's a lot of digital data available. So they're pretty easy to develop. It's not trivial, but it is easy to develop. The second thing is that they're computationally not very demanding, and so you can produce fine spatial resolution if you have the input data at a particular resolution. So for example, thinking about how climate affects species distributions, you can get down to 30-meter spatial resolution if you want to, which is quite fine actually, because it doesn't take very much computational power to run 30 meters across, say, the western US. Whereas if you had a fairly complex mechanistic model, you might not be able to run that because it would take too long, days, weeks, years, for a computer to finish given fine spatial resolution. So those are two strengths of species distribution models. There are a number of weaknesses, however, mostly related to this ignoring of biological interactions that I mentioned before. So these interactions are competition, disturbances, predation, shifting food resources or habitat, dispersal was another one I mentioned. So those are ignored, not considered in the model. And yet, so the first point is that models are developed using the realized, not the fundamental niche. I mentioned this earlier. The species may actually tolerate a broader range of climate than actually represented by the observations because the places that it's not observed are limited because of competition. So let me go back to this one slide that shows this. Up in here, we have no observations because perhaps there was a competitor, a superior competitor there, or predator there that limits the species distribution. Okay, so we don't actually know. It's possible that the species may tolerate warmer conditions or drier conditions. That's difficult to evaluate with species distribution models. So predictions using species distribution modeling are probably better for where species will become extinct. Okay, so we know, excuse me, we know locations of where species have been observed. Those are used to develop the model. So we know in those locations that there's no competitor or predator or dispersal issues. There's no biotic interactions that are limiting those. So if we can correctly build in the climate responses of that species, then we can predict whether that species may go extinct or actually extirpated from that location given future climate change. So the model's better for predicting where. The model predictions are better for predicting where a species may go extinct, and they're worse for predicting where a species may move in the future into new habitat. So we expect with future climate change that warming will open up habitat at more northerly or higher elevations for species, and that may be true, and the model may predict that, but there also may be existing predators in those locations that limit whether that species can actually inhabit that. So species may the climate may be suitable in those new locations, but there might be biotic interactions that would limit the ability for a species to establish in those new locations. Okay, so how does one develop a species distribution model? You can see that illustrated here. So the top set of variables are maps of potential explanatory variables. Here they call them environmental layers. These are the input variables, explanatory, predictor variables, however you want to think about it. You can see maps of temperature, of precipitation, some other variables, geology. These might be, variable X might be topography, slope, variable Y might be aspect, things like that. These are potential predictor variables. And then you also have the species data, which as in most cases are just observations of where species are located. And again, you can get these from online databases often, or perhaps you need to do your own surveys if you're studying the species. So the dots here correspond to locations, and with geographic information systems capability, you can pull out the suite of environmental variables for this particular location. You just look in each of these maps at that particular location, and so you have the set of environmental variables associated with all of these locations. Those form the inputs to the model development. You can then develop the model and evaluate it, and then predict for this entire region what the model says about the distribution, whether there's presence, as in here, or absence of that. And you do that because you have all of the variables, the values of a particular variable at each of these locations. So you can make predictions of the model and therefore determine that, well, if we looked hard in this region, the model predicts there would be absences. So that's a good test of the model. Go out and survey these locations and see if you can find any of these species there. You can see that there is an omission error here, that there is actually, there was a observed location of the species, but here the model predicts an absence. So that's an omission error that when we want to minimize. Because there are no absence, I'm assuming there are no absence records, we can't test commission error. So it's possible that in this region up here there might be a field survey that reported no species in this particular location. However, the model predicts that the species occurs there. So in that case, if that were the case, that would be a commission error. Again, a model can't be expected to have zero omission errors or zero commission errors, but certainly to have minimal ones, say below 10, 15%, 20%. Anything above that is probably a poor model. Okay, so back to this set of figures which you saw before. Here's the geographical space. Here's the environmental space we talked about. The blue line now is the species distribution model based on the niche. And then this model is then applied back onto the landscape to predict locations. So the polygons in blue are where the model predicts are locations of this particular species. So in one here, this one polygon, the model does a very good job of correctly predicting the actual distribution, that is the realized niche within the one polygon. In two, the model predicts that the realized niche is here, which is most of what the actual realized niche is, which is the full polygon 2, the full gray area. So the model does omit some of these areas here, which is bad, of course, but perhaps if there were additional observations in this polygon 2, especially out here, the model would then be redeveloped and be improved, be higher accuracy. And then in polygon 3, remember from here is a potential distribution but not realized. So this is the the fundamental niche but not the realized niche. So the model does predict that the species would be there incorrectly, but because it's not actually there. But this is an issue, so this would be a commission error. The model's predicting presence, but no presence is there. And so in a modeling statistical sense, it's an error. But there, again, it's a little bit fuzzy because of this question of does the model predict a fundamental niche or a realized niche? And so in this case, what the model is doing is saying this particular area has suitable, say, climate or soils for the species, but the species isn't there, and it may not be there for these biotic interaction reasons. But it may be useful to predict this because for conservation purposes. You may want to know that there's suitable habitat for this species to move into if need be. Okay, I mentioned before that these species distribution models are often called bioclimatic envelope models because a simple way of thinking about this is to just define an envelope of suitable climate and then use that as the particular model. So in this case, if you ignore everything but the red here, you have two climate variables, E1 and E2, and you can just define this rectangle in niche space that says that the species is present if the environmental variable 1 is between x1 and x2, and if environmental 2 is between y1 and y2. That's this rectangle in niche space, and then you can map that back onto the geographic space. So that's the envelope in which the climate envelope in which the species is present. And so that can act as your model. More sophisticated modeling techniques have been developed since, but that is a simple way. Okay, here's the illustration of some of these errors that I've already mentioned. So this is the prediction, the model predictions in geographic space in blue. The actual distribution, which is the realized niche, is in gray. The true positive are places where an X is here, places where the model correctly predicts the observations. The minuses here are called true negatives. That's where the model correctly predicts there is an absence, because there is an absence. And then the two types of errors are the false positive squares. This is a commission error, again, because the model thinks that the species is there, but it's not. And again, this may be related to biological biotic interactions or dispersal barriers, but again, it may be good potential habitat. And then omission errors are indicated by these circles. So that means that the model development was poor for some reason. There weren't observations out here, or there weren't the proper explanatory variables used when developing this model for various reasons. But in this case, both the commission and omission error rates are probably pretty low. Okay, what are some examples of applications? I'll show you a set of case studies now to finish this out. The first is a pretty cool study here that's illustrated for a eastern mole species, a small mammal, in which they had observations in the Pleistocene. That's the last ice age, the last 2 million years or so. So this mole occurred at these dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 locations that were recorded from fossil evidence. And then in the bottom set of, in the bottom figure here, the dots indicate where the mole is found in the current climate, basically, say the last 50 years or so. So one can develop 2 sets of models, these niche models or species distribution models. So first, one develops the model based on the Pleistocene observations. Okay, and in this particular map, here's the map of where the mole occurs based on the model and the climate during the Pleistocene. And so you can see it does a pretty good job of fitting these observations, and then most of the eastern US, and particularly the southern part of the eastern US, is covered by a presence map. Then you can run the model forward in time using the current climate and predict where the mole will be in the present distribution. And so that's the black here. And then you can compare the model with the observed locations in the dots to see how well the model does. That's an independent test of the model. And you can see it does a pretty good job of capturing most of the areas. Here's a bunch of points that are omitted, incorrectly omitted from the model prediction. So these are errors. Somehow there's something about the distribution in the Great Plains in the present time that's that's not being captured by the model. And also the model doesn't capture southern Florida very well because there are presence records, but the model doesn't predict presence. Okay, so then you can turn that around and say, okay, I'm going to, or these authors built a model based on the presence observations. These are the same ones down here, but now these observations are used to predict the model, or develop the model and predict it. You can see the predictions again, they miss this segment to the bit, a little bit to the westernmost edge. Not quite as bad as in the Pleistocene model prediction, but still missing. Once the model is built based on the present observations, then the authors ran it for the climate conditions in the Pleistocene. And you can see, again, the model does a pretty good job of capturing the mole distribution in the Pleistocene, but there is this one point that's fairly well outside the presence distribution. So this is a pretty good example, not very frequently used because it requires both climate data in the Pleistocene and Pleistocene observation records. But it does show that this particular model does a pretty good job. And so when we use a particular model, this particular model, forward in time to evaluate how climate change or other effects will influence distribution of these moles. We have a lot of confidence in the ability for that, of that model and its results. So here's another example of a distribution model used to look at this particular plant species in southern Africa, around Cape Town, if you know where that is, the west coast, southwest coast of Africa. So blacks are the current locations, records of observations, and in this case, the red is the model predicted observations given current climate. You can see that most of the observations are well covered by the mapped or modeled distribution, so there's not a whole lot of omission errors. Here might be an omission error. And then the next prediction is what will happen in the future given climate change. You can see the range, the distribution shrinks considerably and shifts so that much of the distribution is now to the east and focused around, I think this is a mountainous area, higher elevations because of warmer conditions, and a whole lot of current habitat is left unoccupied, or unsuitable, I should say. This will be conditions that are likely to be too hot. I think that's probably the scenario. to support this particular plant species, and so that's a concern for conservation. Here's another example of an invasive forest insect called hemlock woolly adelgid. Attacks hemlocks on the east coast. So a species distribution model was developed using observations and then ran for two different scenarios of climate change. A lower emissions scenario where we limit future climate change by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and then a higher emissions scenario where I think this is basically continue to burn fossil fuels at the same rate we are today. And so then we can see, okay, where will hemlocks be susceptible to this invasive insect given climate change, given these two scenarios of climate change. And basically the southern distribution doesn't change much. The insect has invaded most of, say, New York through southern part of Maine, and this blue line, that doesn't change much. And then out into the future, which are the different colors, is when things start to change substantially. So by the end of this century, 2070 to 2099, in the lower emission scenario, the northern limit of this insect will still be fairly close to where it is today, slicing through the center part of Maine. But given the higher emission scenario, which we expect to experience more warming, that will allow the insect to move northward, farther northward, and therefore all of Maine basically will be under conditions that are suitable for this insect. So that obviously is of concern because hemlocks in then the full range of the United States will be susceptible to this insect, whereas here there might be some areas that where hemlocks could be saved. Here's another two examples using tree species of the western U.S. This is work done by Jerry Rayfeld, who was here at the Forest Service in Moscow. This looks at Engelmann spruce, and the colors are the species distribution model predictions. So interestingly here, in this case, they provide confidence in the model through what's called a voting technique. The greens indicate higher confidence because more models predicted presence. And so what these authors did was predict hundreds to thousands of different models, species distribution models, each using a slightly different set of observations. And so the models were slightly different and different techniques to develop the model. So they had a suite of hundreds to thousands, I don't remember how many, of models, and then they counted the percentage of votes that predicted presence. And so these yellow areas indicate areas where fewer models predicted presence. The green areas indicate areas where most of the models or all the models predicted presence. So that gives you some indicator of model confidence. And then the second thing is, so again, this is the application of the model for the full Western U.S., not just the observation points, of course. And so what they did was they used an independent ancillary data set produced by a person named Little, who mapped the distribution of Engelmann spruce, and these maps are these polygons, gray polygons. So that's an independent check on the model, and the model does pretty good, as you can see. There are some areas that are missing. And in fact, they highlight that with this zoom at the bottom where there's predicted Engelmann spruce, but no information from the little map there. Same thing at the northern boundary out in these islands of potential habitat. So a nice test of the model predictions using an ancillary data set. And then again, Rayfeld looked at how climate will affect, in this case, subalpine fir distributions. So here's in the upper left is today's distribution model range where, again, they predict probabilities. So red is higher probability of presence, yellow is some probability of presence. And then watch how, as the model predicts the distribution given climate in 2030s, 2060s, and 2090s, how the distribution of subalpine fir changes. And of course, you can see it shrinks because of warming, moves uphill, and in fact is vastly reduced relative to 2000 by 2090, which is of course of concern. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is a case study that I was particularly, I was involved in. I had a master's student, Jason Truk, doing this work, as well as another research associate, Polly Biot. We were looking at the distribution of American pika, which is a small mammal. You can see the photo here. It's a cousin of the rabbit. It looks like a cross between a mouse and a rabbit. It lives in high elevations. You may have seen these or heard them squeak when you're hiking. They use talus slopes, rocky slopes, as their habitat. Because of climate change and some studies that were suggesting that populations were being extirpated or going extinct, the pikas were being considered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as threatened or endangered, which would invoke a whole lot of policy implications, and so it was quite important for land managers in the western U.S. So we were interested in doing a species distribution model study that would look at where habitat was today, as well as where it might be in coming decades given climate change. So that was the thesis work of Jason Truk. We used a set of occurrence presence points. These are the pluses indicated on the maps. You can see that they're scattered throughout the western U.S. Some locations are better sampled than other locations. For instance, lots of areas in northwest Wyoming and northern Wyoming were well sampled. Other areas that are known in Colorado were not very well sampled. And you can see actually in southern Oregon, there was someone who was doing a systematic survey because of the regular spacing of the pluses. Okay, so Jason used Maxent which is a modeling a software that uses these presence points to predict where pikas might occur, what the suitable habitat is for pikas given current climate, and that's shown as gray here. So the grays are the model application of where habitat is suitable for pikas. We also looked at subspecies distributions, which are less important for this talk, but those are the dashed lines. Okay, so then after building the model, we could look at how the potential explanatory variables or the important explanatory variables varied or influenced the probability of occurrence. Here we're calling this probability of occurrence, but it's effectively the same as absence. Probability of presence. So that's the response variable, and we selected 4 different explanatory variables as being important. The most important was summer maximum temperature, and if you just focus on that and these solid lines, the west-wide indicates that there was sort of a nonlinear relationship where below a certain maximum temperature there was little effect, and the effect was pretty high, so the probability of presence was 0.75 or so, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. For low, that is cooler summers. But then the probability of presence went down substantially to almost 0 when in locations where the summer temperatures were very high, above 25 degrees C. So again, a nonlinear relationship with a couple thresholds. The other temperature and precipitation variables were a little bit more mixed. For instance, summer precipitation here didn't look like it had much of an effect. Again, focus on the solid line. It kind of went up and down, but in this case, you have to sort of squint your eyes and look in general and see that there wasn't a whole lot of change across this gradient of very dry to very wet conditions. So there wasn't a whole lot of influence of summer precipitation on the probability of occurrence or presence of pikas. That's different, of course, than summer maximum temperature. And then we ran the models again with various climate change scenarios. So B1, A1B, and A2 were 3 different scenarios that had increasing amounts of warming by the end of the century. And so if you look at this map, you can see that if you just focus on the red, which is the emission scenario with the most amount of warming, you can see that there's substantial shrinkage of potential habitat of pika, so that the red areas are far less in terms of total area than the gray areas. So, and that's of concern. That suggests that perhaps in many regions, the Cascades in Washington, for instance, the habitat will be greatly reduced or eliminated in many places. But there also are places of refugia in the Sierra Nevada and in the highest elevations of Colorado. And then to zoom in on Colorado, to show you the fragmentation, which is another issue. Again, the gray is today's potential habitat. Red is what will happen in the future given a high emission scenario, lots of warming. You can see that there will be lots of fragmentation, that, for instance, this area here will be separated from these areas out here, which may pose problems in terms of exchanging of genes among these different populations. The habitat becomes fragmented, and therefore gene flow between these regions will become more restricted, which may lead to, well, interestingly, speciation, but probably more likely to lead to difficulties in terms of dispersal if a particular location experiences extirpation of these animals. So it'll be difficult to recolonize potential habitat areas. Okay, so just a couple comments. So we tried to get this published in scientific journals. We were rejected multiple times. Various reasons why, mostly related to the absence of important explanatory variables that determine pika habitat. So first, we didn't include talus maps because there aren't good maps of talus. And so although a particular location might have suitable climate, if it doesn't have talus, that is rocky slopes, pikas couldn't occupy that. There were important variables that we didn't include. So we know that the presence of subtalus snow or water is really is important, but we didn't have information about the temperatures at, say, 2 feet below the surface. We only had air temperatures, and yet it's the subtalus temperature instead of the surface temperature that's going to be important. So that was an issue. We didn't know about snow cover as insulation. There's this effect of a drainage of cold air through talus slopes. So if a talus slope extends from a valley all the way up to a mountain top or ridge, as often is the case, these are very porous features on the surface, and cold air can actually drain from the top to the bottom, and that may cool habitat at lower elevations for pikas, making those lower elevation areas more suitable. But we couldn't include that. That was too complicated. And then lastly, we're uncertain about the pika's ability to make behavioral modifications. We do know that pikas live in some areas that are very warm, in the Columbia Gorge, for instance, or in Craters of the Moon National Monument, extremely warm. In those situations or in those places, pikas have habitat or access to habitat that is quite deep. So for instance, in Craters of the Moon, there are lava tubes and very porous spaces that the pikas can, that allow them to go deep into the surface, below the surface, and avoid those very warm conditions at the surface. In addition, pikas in these locations seem to have modified their feeding behavior. So instead of feeding at noon or during the day when it's very hot, they feed at evening at dawn and dusk. So they've modified their behavior to some degree, and they've taken advantage of some aspects of the landscape. We couldn't include those in our model. We just didn't know how to do that. It's too complicated. So in the end, we couldn't get this work published. I do know that someone else did. So they were able to address these concerns satisfactorily somehow. So I think we were on the right track. We just didn't pursue it hard enough, I guess. So this concludes the lecture on species distribution modeling. You will have a homework assignment, in fact, related to pikas, in which you'll develop species distribution maps and models using Maxent and evaluate how habitat will change with climate change. So that's all.